Hello, glad to have you here today. Today we're going to explore some instructions for acceptable and meaningful conduct in our various relationships. To cover that subject, we're going to be beginning a study of Proverbs and the Song of Songs. Now, this will be a 13-week study, and this is week 1. Most of the focus is going to be on Proverbs. That'll be 11 of those lessons, and the last 2 lessons will be on Song of Songs. Now, in the Old Testament, both Proverbs and Song of Songs are included in what's called the wisdom literature. And this wisdom literature is also called the writings. As you know, there's the law, the prophets, and the writings. Some of the other books found in the writings are Psalms, Job, and Ecclesiastes. Now, wisdom may be defined as the proper application of knowledge. And it can be viewed as 3 levels. First level, skill or ability to perform a job. That is something that can be taught, and it's perfected in experience and practice. The second level of wisdom has to do with living a productive, successful life through honest, fair, and humble relationships with others. And finally, there's a third level, which focuses on the profound issues of human life. That's the sort of thing that you read about in the book of Job. It involves good and evil, human suffering, life's meaning and purpose, and that sort of thing. Most of what we'll be focusing on in the book of Proverbs will be living a productive and useful life. Now, as far as the date of Proverbs and the authorship of Proverbs, much of the book comes from the mind of Solomon. He has written tens of thousands of Proverbs on his own, and that's recorded in the book of Kings. And he not only has included his thinking, but also some knowledge from ancient literature, some which dates back to 2,000 years before Jesus. And that would be about 1,000 years before Solomon. Now, some of this ancient literature is attributed to Agur, a person that we don't really know much about, but obviously a wise man, and also to King Lemuel. And these gentlemen were probably from outside of the nation and the sphere of Israel. The book was probably put into its final form in around 700 BC. And this was under the reign of King Hezekiah in Judah. Now, the purpose of Proverbs was primarily to educate young men. And they were taught to fear God and avoid evil as a basis for living. So Proverbs provides a godly world view. And more than once in the book, we're reminded that true knowledge and wisdom begin with the right relationship with God. Okay, let's start our scripture. Page 10 in the Sunday school book. And we'll be studying verses 7 through 19 in the first chapter of Proverbs. And this lesson is found on page 10 in through the Bible. Now, situations in life require making choices. And through this lesson, may we learn to accept the fact that making wise choices starts with having a right relationship with God. In Proverbs, we will receive practical instruction for living successfully and avoiding the pitfalls of foolish actions. This teaching is still relevant in the modern world. So it may have been written and codified hundreds of years ago. It's still valid today. Now, in the initial 7 verses of chapter 1, we're not going to cover them all here, but the purpose of the book of Proverbs is to instill knowledge and develop wisdom to apply one's knowledge appropriately. But we're going to start with chapter 1, verse 7. Okay, let me read this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. Now let's talk a little bit about the meaning of the word fear. It means a deep sense of awe, worship, and humble submission to the one true God. And this describes a world view. It's a sober and humble acknowledgement of our accountability to God for the ways we think, speak, and act each day. Now, we are aware that we're unworthy to be in His presence. So this phrase points to the gospel of Christ. Through Christ, we can have a right relationship with God even though we are imperfect. It depends on God's grace and our faith. Furthermore, in verse 7, we learn that those who do not revere God are fools. Their reasoning has been morally twisted. We come to the conclusion, based on this verse, the only knowledge worth having is the knowledge that comes from God. Okay, let's read verses 8 and 9. Here we have the words of the teacher here. Starting with verse 8. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't reject your mother's teaching. For they will be a garland of favor on your head and pendants around your neck. So, what basically it's telling us is honor your parents by obeying their guidance. And when the author uses the word listen, he's saying take this to heart. Pay close attention. Now, it says, listen, my son. Young men were taught to be leaders, this particular society. So, the reference is from the father to the son throughout this book. But in Christ, we know that there is neither male nor female, young or old, and we all are joined as children of God based on God's grace and our faith. Now, he goes on in verse 9 to point out that you will be favored in your community for following godly guidance. Now, in this day and time when Proverbs was written, it was common for wealthy people and people of noble descent to have teachers. They would hire a teacher for their son and sons. But it's true today that the first and primary school for the next generation is in the home. So, this is the path we want to follow, as described in verse 8 and 9. Now, in verses 10 to 14, we are shown a path that we want to avoid. So let's read verses 10 through 14. My son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. If they say, come with us, let's set an ambush and kill someone. Let's attack some innocent person just for fun. Let's swallow them alive like Sheol, whole like those who go down to the pit. We'll find all kinds of valuable property and fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot with us, and we'll all share the loot. Okay, the teacher starts in verse 10 by saying, boy, it's a jungle out there. And what you need to do is to look out for those who fall short of God's standards. That's who he's referring to when he says sinners. And of course, the way this is stated and spoken, what he's describing suggests a kind of gang culture that we're familiar with in our time. Now, here in verse 11, we have an invitation to have some adventure. The challenge to commit some senseless act of violence just to see what we do. They're describing what they do for fun. And when they mention Sheol, that's what we would call hell, the residing place of the dead. And what they're saying in verse 12 is, with us, you can send someone to hell if we choose to do that. Now, verse 11 points out, furthermore, that not only will this be exciting, but it will be profitable. And so they offer to share with this young man both the treasure and the adventure. And they're saying, what do you say to that? Okay. In 15 through 19, we get what Dad wants to give as a glimpse of the consequences. So let's read beginning in verse 15. My son, don't travel that road with them or set foot on their path, because their feet run toward evil and they hurry to shed blood. It is useless to spread a net where any bird can see it. But they set an ambush to kill themselves. They attack their own lives. Such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. It takes the lives of those who receive it. Okay. Dad's wanting to be sure that the son understands that there are consequences to temptations. And he's saying in verse 15, don't give it a second thought. Dismiss the invitation immediately. It goes in one ear and out the other. Do not retain it and dwell on it. That is the response to temptation by a godly person. The teacher goes on to say that these men are not only walking down the wrong path, they're running at breakneck speed. Now, verse 17 is a truism. It is useless to spread a net where any bird can see it. In other words, in order to be effective, the net has to be hidden. And what we can take away from that is that a person can be caught in a trap if he's not able to see the consequences. And furthermore, evildoers cannot see the consequence, and neither can those who they convince to join them. So verse 18 shows the intent of the teacher for using this truism. The sinner's plan for evil lead to their own destruction. In other words, the one they're trying to entice can't see the net, and they're unable to see the net themselves. So in verse 19, we see some references that we find in the New Testament. Verse 19 says, "Such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. It takes the lives of those who receive it." And we're reminded of Matthew 7, verse 13, which says, "Wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction." Taking that path, sin may become a way of life. Also, the teacher points out that dishonest gain, in other words, fraudulent business, is a sin just as taking an innocent life is a sin. And Romans 6:23 reminds us that for the wages of sin is death. And that echoes this phrase in verse 19, "It takes the lives of who receive that dishonest gain." So, we have the beginning of a series, kind of sets the tone for what we'll be studying for the next few weeks, and it should give us some insight in how to conduct ourselves in a way that leads to a useful and fruitful life and good relationships with those around us. So thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it.